Zambia has signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The free trade area is envisioned to be the largest in the world. On today's edition of News in Depth, Masauso Mkwayaya looks at the challenges and opportunities that the free trade area presents. However, suggestions that Zambia will become a dumping site for cheaper goods from a continental market of well over 1.2 billion people are prominent. I'm your host, Ruth Kamwi. Stay tuned.
This is Africa, and this is the largest migration of animals second to none on Earth. About 2 million wildebeest have congregated in Tanzania's Serengeti National Park on a migration up north into Kenya's Masai Mara National Park. The animals move to look for greener pasture across borders. The migrating herds encounter various challenges on the journey, ranging from rough terrains to attacks from predators. The animals migrate clockwise on the 2,896 kilometers voyage that wildlife experts describe as an endless cycle of life with no beginning or end. This is the basic idea behind calls for seamless and borderless trade, at least among African countries. Against a background of 1.3 billion people, a seamless trade regime is envisioned to be at the center of greater benefits from the continent's socio-economic exploits. The free movement of goods and people is an advanced form of regional integration which most African countries have subscribed to for decades but have failed to actualize.
The idea was to have political solidarity, and I think the thinking at that time was that along with political solidarity, it was useful to have economic solidarity. With that, then a notion was born that from the African Union point of view, all these regional blocks, SADC, COMESA, East African Community, ECOWAS, and so on, they were supposed to build up to a continental or continent-wide free trade agreement.
This ambitious plan gained traction during the 18th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in January 2012. During this high-level meeting, African leaders present adopted a decision to establish a continental free trade area by an indicative date of 2017. The summit also endorsed the action plan on boosting intra-Africa trade, which identifies 7 priority action clusters, namely trade policy, trade facilitation and productive capacity, trade-related infrastructure, trade finance, trade information, and factor market integration. African leaders held an extraordinary summit on the African Continental Free Trade Area AfCFTA from 17th to 21st March 2018 in Kigali, Rwanda, during which the agreement establishing the AfCFTA was presented for adoption. This was along with the Kigali Declaration and the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to the free movement of persons, right to residence and the right to establishment. In total, 44 out of the 55 AU member states signed the consolidated text of the AfCFTA agreement. 47 signed the Kigali Declaration and 30 signed the protocol on free movement. Zambia did not sign the AfCFTA declaration during this meeting, but however signed the agreement during the 32nd Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union on 10th February 2019 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, Kayola Siame, witnessed the signing of the historical Continental Free Trade Agreement.
As Zambia, we have been part of the process of coming up with the framework agreement, the negotiations, and having an input into ensuring that we can also have an agreement that does support and also that does provide benefits for Zambia as a country. When the 2063 agenda, the AU 2063 agenda was done, one of the things that have been highlighted in there is that the inter-Africa trade is very, very low. I think something like around 10% at the moment. And in order to increase that trade, one of the measures that was agreed was to have a free trade area. So the objective, one of the key objectives of that is that we are working towards increasing trade among the African countries by 50% by 2022. That was the target that has been given, and that's the target that we are looking forward to.
The Private Sector Development Association says the signing of the agreement is a step in the right direction. Association Chairperson Yusuf Dodia has, however, urged government to look into having domestically driven programs which will ensure Zambia benefits from such an agreement.
Now we need to make a deliberate effort to enter into these markets by having some domestically driven programs that will ensure that the Zambian private sector can benefit from the opportunities which are presented by these free trade areas. And we must learn from history. Back in 2000, we were exposed to the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was free market access into the United States, both quota-free as well as tariff-free. We didn't do much with it.
The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, is a free trade area with 21 member states stretching from Tunisia to Eswatini in the south of the continent. The establishment is a pioneer of regional trade integration, of which Zambia is a founding member. The organization's headquarters are housed in Zambia's capital, Lusaka. COMESA Director Trade, Customs and Monetary Affairs, Francis Mangeni, feels the Continental Free Trade Agreement is an opportunity for member states to create a conducive environment where young people will be allowed to innovate and participate in economic affairs.
We have the youngest population in the world, and this is projected to be the case going forward up to the year 2050, even 2100. Now, what this means is that there are opportunities. Youth is associated with vigor, with creativity, with new ideas. So this is energy which can help to boost economic activity, economic growth. But also there's a risk in that these people need jobs.
The free trade area will be the largest in the world in terms of participating countries since the formation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995. The merging of 55 countries into a single market means a combined GDP of about 3.4 trillion United States dollars. However, for the agreement to come into force, 22 of the 55 countries on the continent will have to ratify the document.
We're having a lot of consultations with the private sector. So even now that we have signed the CFTA, we are going to have more consultations. So by the time we do come to an understanding or an agreement that we need to ratify, I think we'll have done more studies, we'll have done more consultation within the public sector, but mostly within the private sector, because it's the private sector that is industrializing our economy. It's the private sector that will be providing the goods and the services. So that is one of the key elements which wasn't there before when we entered the previous FTAs, which we have said is going to be the top of our discussion point moving forward, and also the top of our consultative process.
As of March 6, 2019, 18 countries had already ratified the document. The document will be taken to Parliament for local ratification before presenting the instruments to the African Union.
Our market is too small, so if we remain only fixated on 14 million people, then it's very difficult to grow, because we're saying, no, we can't expand because we're only 14 million people. But now we're looking at 1.5 billion people. It means it gives you an advantage to go out and expand your capacity so that you can supply that market, which is beyond what is only available in Zambia.
The Center for Trade Policy and Development, CTPD, is optimistic that Zambian professionals will be exposed to more opportunities as a result of Zambia belonging to the Continental Free Trade Area.
If we are to remain relevant as a country to this new era, one of the things that we need to do is to relook at how our curriculum is, to what extent is it tailored at providing solutions for the current generation and the coming generation. If we find that the areas that we need to improve on, of course, there are actually a number of areas that we need to improve on, especially when it comes to sciences and mathematics. A number of players within sectors such as the extractive sector have actually continued to complain that they have a challenge in terms of finding expertise that have got a certain kind of skills that they need in their sectors.
It is important to note that this is not the first time that Zambia is belonging to a trade bloc. The country already belongs to SADC and COMESA, where it enjoys duty-free and quota-based trade. The Zambia Association of Manufacturers, ZAM, says belonging to the largest free trade area in the world will not change much because the country is already enjoying free trade with over 20 countries that have a combined market of over 520 million people.
To that market, basically what we are adding to what we already have would be West Africa, which we really don't have that much access to because there are obviously other trade barriers like customs duties when it comes to trade with ECOWAS. We already trade in COMESA, so nothing really changes, and we already trade in SADC. So basically it gives us a huge market. But the same huge market means it gives us more competition. And I think that's where the issue is, and that's where the preparedness should be.
Trade experts are wondering what difference the Continental Free Trade Area will present to Zambia when the country has failed to fully benefit from SADC and COMESA, which operate under the same framework. The Zambia Institute of Policy Analysis and Research, ZIPA, Senior Research Fellow Cesar Cello, says benefits from the ratification of the Free Trade Agreement will be marginal because Zambia is not benefiting from the already existing trade deals under organizations such as COMESA.
If you think about it, the markets that we already have under our belt, South Africa, DRC, Angola, and so on, the big buyer sort of markets with big urban populations with buying power, we haven't been able to fully exploit them. So even if we open up and are looking to Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, which are far afield, we will not benefit much unless we do something that helps us to have a unique selling point or a unique selling perspective of our exports to those economies.
Mr. Cello feels this is because Zambia entered the regional trade blocs with an infant private sector, a thing that the Private Sector Development Association agrees with.
We need to be able to see a financing system that is going to promote the financing of export production. In other words, our banking system needs to be speaking with the private sector and looking at what kind of packages can be put together in order to finance production in Zambia for export into the region.
And Zambia's trade numbers in COMESA speak to what the experts are saying. For instance, in 2016, Zambia recorded the biggest negative intra-COMESA trade balance, exporting goods worth slightly over $600 million compared to imports worth $1.5 billion in the same year. The continent's second largest copper producer recorded the biggest import market share in COMESA at 18.8%, followed by the Democratic Republic of Congo, which registered a 12.7% of the import market shares in the trade bloc. Imports in 2016 were mainly made up of copper ores and concentrates, and COMESA Director Trade Customs and Monetary Affairs, Dr. Mangeni, says the Eastern and Southern African regional bloc has enormous trade potential which has not been exploited by member states.
What has been the challenge is for a country to utilize its potential, to tap into its potential. In COMESA, for instance, we have got a current trade potential of $82.3 billion every year. This is unutilized. It's there. There are markets, there are trade opportunities to follow up if you wish to, but they are not being followed up. Now the problem, yes, why? Because there is lack of information about these opportunities. So people will import things from China, not knowing that those things are available where? Next door.
The ministry says the Continental Free Trade Area will create a lot of opportunities underpinned by industrialization. Ministry Permanent Secretary Kayula Siame says Zambia will use limitations faced in SADC and COMESA as lessons to draw up best practices before fully committing to the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
We had no lessons to learn, and we didn't have anything to fall back on. But now that we are in the SADC, COMESA free trade areas, we have a lot of lessons that we have learned. And these are the lessons that we are using in our negotiations in terms of the protocols and the annexes that are part of the Continental Free Trade Area.
The Agenda 2063 is a long-term vision for Africa, which expects the continent to have a free, peaceful and prosperous Africa, which is dynamic and influential in the world. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is among many plans contained in the ambitious 2063 Agenda. The AfCFTA agreement seeks to boost intercontinental trade from about 20 to 50% by 2022. The historical agreement is expected to build on already existing regional trade areas such as COMESA, SADC, and ECOWAS.
There's what's called the Abuja Treaty, or the treaty establishing the African Economic Community. This treaty says we should be a full economic community as Africa by 2028, having what you're calling a common market, a monetary union, actually an economic union. So, and this is set out in Article 6 of that treaty. It sets out stages that, first of all, 6 stages. That first of all, each regional economic community, like COMESA, SADC, ECOWAS, IGAD, East African Community, each one of those should establish a free trade area, trade in goods.
Gabriel Chiwe, a cross-border trader who operates from the Saka's COMESA market, named after the regional trade body, attends to customers in his small-scale fabric shop. COMESA market is located just behind the regional headquarters. Chiwe says he and other traders have greatly benefited from trade agreements under COMESA and is optimistic that the Continental Free Trade Agreement will be bigger and better.
COMESA and the SADC is a very good program. There is a list, a common list, for example, books, ball pens. So if you are the member, you use about $2,000 US, which is about approximately of 20,000. You buy those in bulk, you are not even pay anything. That is a duty-free. But if you buy more than $2,000, you can do so. It's an advantage to us.
One of the most essential technical, administrative, and regulatory aspects of belonging to a free trade area is tariff harmonization. However, for countries like Zambia that see some tariffs on certain goods and products as a source of revenue, harmonization may mean loss of revenue. Perhaps this is why the Center for Trade Policy and Development is recommending to government for them to engage in consultations on ways to compensate on the anticipated revenue loss against the perceived benefits.
Our recommendation from the Center for Trade Policy and Development is that as they are doing the consultations, that's one of the things that we need to resolve. In terms of how we are comparing the revenue forgone against the perceived benefits, to what extent are we going to have a situation where we benefit more from this arrangement?
But Cesar Chelo says he does not expect Zambia to lose a lot of revenue from harmonized tariffs because the country is already operating under a similar arrangement in SADC and COMESA.
There isn't much adjustment that will happen. Even in terms of the revenue that would be lost, is minimal. Because if you look at the trade that we currently have with West Africa, it's only about $4 million a year, compared to about $8 billion of imports with the whole world. So the West African configuration is a small trade partner. So even if you were to talk about the most optimistic loss, you'd be talking about still less than $1 million in revenue that the government would be losing.
And the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, ZAM, anticipates that opening up to the rest of Africa will expose the country's infant manufacturing sector to bigger and stronger economies such as Kenya and South Africa.
The sector I come from, a lot of cable from South Africa doesn't find itself in East Africa, especially also on road. And so Zamefa has been very successful in East Africa. Are we going to say the same when we open up for South Africa to trade into East Africa, that our market share in that market will be the same? The answer might be no, and I think that's where we need a whole lot of homework to do.
But the Southern African Cross-Border Traders Association says the realization of the risks that Zambia is expected to face in the AfCFTA should be treated as a challenge to improve how the country attends to regional trade.
In a world where there's no competition, there's no creativity. So this is a challenge to our industry. They must look at the capacity that they are able to produce products that can actually sell across Africa or even outside Africa. We shouldn't just be depending on companies that are coming from outside.
The Center for Trade Policy and Development says for the country to benefit from the Continental Trade Area, government should begin devoting attention to make sure that the extractive industry not only benefits mine owners but also local people, especially those in areas where the mines operate.
Begin a conversation around ensuring that we also devote a lot of our attention towards ensuring that as these minerals are being extracted, they're not only being extracted to the benefit of the people that are bringing in some finance, but they also get to benefit the indigenous Zambian citizens, including those that are hosting these mining investments.
Makambwe also feels the industrial potential in the local multi-facility economic zones is something that should be looked into with utmost seriousness in order to prepare the country for continental trade.
The implementation of the multi-facility economic zones, its intent was to provide the capacity to actually enhance manufacturing and transfer of technology. So Zambia should actually be proud to say we are also able to manufacture certain type of technology that we can take and export outside.
The Continental Free Trade Area means that the Zambian market will be flooded with a lot of goods from other countries. Some of these goods are cheaper and may saturate similar local products, a thing that may affect the local producers and probably drive them out of business. And this is why the manufacturers are calling on government to protect local businesses by effecting trade instruments such as the local content policy.
Our market is not that much protected, and we have to look at it and ensure that our local content strategy is actually implemented before we even go into the tripartite free trade area, so that at least we can safeguard the local market for the local manufacturers and let the competition then be also fairly in terms of then competing in the other markets.
And Caesar Chelo, a seasoned research fellow at one of Zambia's policy think tanks, has urged government to be very deliberate as they negotiate for trade rules and regulations which will protect the domestic market.
When it comes to signing the specific instruments and ratifying them domestically, you have to make sure that they actually protect your interests and the interests of your domestic economy. That means you have to be very deliberate and drag your feet a little bit to make sure that you have done the right research, you have done the right assessment of those instruments, that they speak to your domestic economy and will protect your domestic economy.
And the Minister of Commerce says policies to protect the local sectors are already on the planning table. The ministry noted that stakeholders are already being engaged for input on the matter.
As a ministry, we have already put in place the policies, because first you start at the policy level so that that guides you. We have the industrial policy, we have the trade policy, we have the export strategy, we have the investment promotion strategy, we have also our local content strategy. So these overarching policies, which cut across all sectors, are the ones that are guiding us to ensure that we can support the development of all the different sectors.
The Private Sector Development Association wants to see local statutory bodies coming together to support and dialogue with SMEs on matters that will improve the business environment in the country.
Government has to lower its expectations in terms of tax collection from SMEs that want to grow. The statutory bodies have to be content to live on government budgetary allocations and not try to make more money than what the government is allocating to them, because the more money they make, the more expensive it is for production in this country.
If well implemented, the AfCFTA is a vision setting the trajectory of Africa's development in the next 5 decades, which is expected to uplift the livelihoods of citizens on the continent. Consistency in policy implementation by member countries is said to be one of the most important expectations to this agreement's success.
Well, this is where we end this week's edition of News in Depth, where Masao Somkwayaya was looking at the challenges and opportunities that the free trade area presents. I've been your host, Ruth Kamwi. Until next week, do stay blessed.